old Sneelock. Welcome to another episode of Old Sneelock's Workshop. We're going to be working on the Union 537 plane again. I want to put the epoxy into the edges of the body and fill up that crack in the front. And I want to fill up the gap in the back of the tote. The first thing I need to do is disassemble. These planes come apart pretty easily. The thing I want to make sure of is to have the right screwdriver to fit the screws. And a nice safe place to keep them while I'm working on it. I just shaved off a bit of the end of this with a file and with a sandpaper. File's to get me some big chunks in there to add some body to it, and the file is, or the sandpaper is to make it so I've got some fine dust in there so it'll fill detail. Then I take my favorite little plastic trays here and a wooden stick, because I'm going to toss this after I'm done with it. And I'm going to mix up a batch of epoxy. What I've been using is this Loctite 5-minute. It's called Translucent Yellow. Seems to work pretty good. And it's an easy application because all you do is take the little plunger and push on it, and it measures out the exact amount that you want. Now, I could make a bigger batch, but I don't see any advantage to doing that, because I want to be able to mix it up, apply it, and then not have to rush to try and get the next batch stuck in someplace. So what I'm going to do is rake over some sawdust onto the epoxy, and then I'm going to stir the epoxy up. I want to mix it really thoroughly so that when it sets up properly. One of the nice things about the 5-minute epoxy is it starts to gel up on you, and that actually is a plus because I want it to have a little body. So when I put it in here, it doesn't just automatically flow out of the hole. And I don't need any extra in there, because extra is just more stuff you got to take off. You're better off putting on a couple of coats than having to file off a whole big gob of. Now on this end, I'm going to be really cautious because that's where the numbers are, and I don't want to make it so that I can't ever see the numbers on the end of the plane again. So I'm going to pretty much leave that untouched. This little part here is going to be under the casting. This little bit of tape here creates a dam and keeps the epoxy from running out of gap so that I can be sure and have that filled all up. Now comes the hard part. You have to wait and let stuff set up. And I have found over time that if I stand here, I'm going to want to fiddle with it. It's only 5-minute epoxy, but 5 minutes can take forever. The thing that I do now is I walk away. And instead of walking away this time, what we're going to do is mix up another batch because we have a tote to do and the top of this knob, which has got some really deep cracks in it. Now it's time to walk away. Okay, the second coat is on. I think we're just about done with this one. Just got to clean it up and remove the excess epoxy. But it's still just a little bit sticky, so I'm going to let it set some more. The original batch has been almost an hour. Even though it's 5-minute epoxy, it's really not set up. Now some of that could be the wood has interacted with the epoxy and slowed it down, or it could be something else. But I usually let it sit for a good 24 hours before I try and really do any work with it. In the meantime, I'm going to walk away. Set up so I can take off the tape. The tape is only there to act as a dam to hold the epoxy in place because as it's setting up, it's a little bit fluid. Now I'm going to go through and true up the corners. The easiest way to do that is with a file and sandpaper. I can use the file to knock off the high points. If I don't, what's going to happen is the sandpaper is going to catch on the high points and tear. And the file has enough structural strength that it can take the extra grease. Now the plane originally had squared corners, but because I've got bamboo on the bottom of it, I'm going to round off the corners. The only reason for doing that is to stop the corners from chipping. This operation is partly why I didn't take a plane to the top of the wood block, because I knew I was going to have to be doing this, and I didn't want to take off material and then set myself up to have to take off more material. I'd rather do it all at once. And after I filled in those cracks, I want to be able to sand the surface flat and flush. When I'm done, I have just wood and epoxy in the cracks. I want to have the top surface be only wood. Grit sandpaper, so it's pretty great, aggressive. I'm going to change out the sandpaper. It's getting pretty well loaded up. The epoxy, even though it sets up hard, is still going to be a little bit gummy for a day or two. Part of the reason that I'm working on it right now is because it is gummy. Now it does tend to load up the sandpaper, but it's a lot faster to shape it and cut it when it's gummy than when it gets brittle. When it's fully set, it gets hard and tends to crack and split and chip on you. So I'm going to make all the edges rounded so I don't have any point load on the epoxy. At least as little as I can get away with. You can see that it gums up the paper a bit. Part of that is the boiled linseed oil. But I needed to put the boiled linseed oil on it just to keep the wood from decaying further. Putting boiled linseed oil on it tends to add some body to this soft, punky wood from so many years of sitting around getting wet. If I went after this with a plain blade, I would more than likely catch a hold of the epoxy and tear it. So I don't want to do that. Sandpaper does tend to load up, which the plain wouldn't do. I don't want to damage the surface just in the interest of speed. Spent so much time on this job already. A few more minutes, one way or the other, won't make any difference. But breaking it certainly will make me very unhappy. Let's count up how much material cost I have into this. The plane itself, in original condition as I brought it home, cost me $10 at the store. Now I was just at a store and saw a plane very similar to this. It wasn't a Union, it was a Stanley. And they wanted $22 for it. And it was in really good condition. So this plane, in really good condition, and I'm not going to worry about whether it's a Union or a Stanley. The Stanley probably has a little less value just because of the age. But when I go through and do this to it, it's no longer an antique. It's not something somebody's going to say, oh, this is an original pristine example of the capability of the Union Plane Company. They're going to say, oh, somebody worked on this. So if I bought the plane for $10 and I got zero money into the bamboo, the epoxy I bought for another job. So even if I say, okay, I'm going to charge off part of the epoxy to this job, I don't think I got much more than 50 cents worth of epoxy in it. So I'm up to $10.50. And boiled linseed oil, okay, maybe another 50 cents. Because I've only used about 3 or 4 ounces all total. Counting the mineral spirits, 6 ounces all together. So 6 ounces of boiled linseed oil mix. Now I'm getting that pretty warm. When you get epoxy warm, it starts to melt. It is plastic. So I want to move over to a different part so I don't overheat it. Now this is the end that's got the numbers stamped on it. So I'm only doing just exactly what I need to do to get the epoxy down flush. And I don't want to sand off those numbers. Because even though this isn't an antique, it's kind of nice to be able to identify it. Now I need to do some work on the tote. So getting back to the cost of the thing, I probably got more into this than what I could sell it for. But I have proven that even though it is an old Union plane and it was in such bad shape that it was barely workable. The tote was broken, the knob was split all to hell, the screws were stripped out, and the blade is still dull as a butter knife, but that'll be taken care of here directly. And the one that I saw in the antique store, I don't know how good a shape the blade was in. I didn't take the blade out of it. So when I'm all done with it, I have a very nice plane that is really just more an exercise in bringing something back from the edge. Before I do the boiled linseed oil on those, I want to put some paint on the head of these screws. So we'll take my favorite sacrificial board. You can buy these paint pens through Granger. Started using them to mark dies, and then when I went to Product Action, we used them all over the place because we were identifying parts as we sorted them. And this paint pen lets you write pretty much anything on anything. So I bought myself some, and I've used them to pinstripe trucks and touch-up tools ever since. When the boiled linseed oil is first put on it, it's shiny, but over time as it dries it becomes a nice satin. Then I go over it with paste wax. It looks beautiful, at least in my estimation. Okay, I got paint drying and blow drying, so I'm going to leave things set here for a little bit. Let them percolate out so I don't get dust all over them doing something else. In the meantime, I'm going to take this rag soaked with boiled linseed oil. I'm going to put it outside. I don't like having those inside the shop. If you guys have any suggestions for new videos or questions about today's video or any of the other videos in the series, just drop a note in the comments below. You know, I read them all. Thanks for watching. I promise, next thing, I'll be doing the sharpening of the blade. I want to see how it works too.